I don't have to
Whatever
really
you feel,
see anything.
whatever you're comfortable with.
Yeah.
But we are now live.
Okay. Good.
Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Joe Szimhart. His last name is spelled Szimhart, pronounced Szimhart. And he came to my attention after I was kind of surfing the web and came across Steve Hassan's YouTube channel. And I saw that he had just published a book. The title of the book we're going to talk about tonight is Santa Fe, Bill Tate and Me, How an Artist Became a Cult Interventionist. I just completed it this morning. It's a fascinating book. It's chock full of wisdom about alternate religions is a nice way of saying it. You could also categorize them as cults, but Joe has had quite a lot of experience and put a lot of his wisdom into the book. So I'm delighted that he agreed to the interview. Joe, are you there?
Yeah, I am. Thanks for inviting me, Bill. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. For people who may not have heard of you, can you talk a little bit about what led you to write this book? I mean, I know that's part of what's in the book because it's kind of a memoir, but can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, sure. I started the project almost 10 years ago, and the idea was to answer the question, how did you get into deprogramming? You know, what got you into exit counseling? It sounds like an interesting field, and I thought, you know, it's a part of my life that I wanted to record mainly for my daughters, because it's dedicated to my 3 daughters, because I wanted to let them know something about what the old man did, you know, in that period of time that I was away from home. And and that means that the intervention work I did demanded a lot of traveling. For instance, I was flown down to Australia about 18 times, to Europe a dozen times, to Canada, to Trinidad, and all over the States to do these interventions. So yeah, the book is a way to tell that story. I did an earlier version of it that was rejected by publishers, but it was way too much information. I had like 200 footnotes. This time, I don't have any footnotes, and I shrunk it down to keep it kind of more readable. Hopefully it is, but you know, like they say, it is what it is right now. It's a record, and I'm planning another book that might be a little bit more formal approach as to how to explain how cults appear and what they are and how to deconstruct them, that kind of thing, more of an educational approach to it. But,
so yeah. You have a book upcoming, but you've also written a few academic papers on cults as well that have been published in academic journals, correct?
Yeah, I've had articles published in journals and books, especially the Cultic Studies Journal, and you know, I've done book reviews. I've had some things published in the Skeptical Inquirer over the years. I mean, nothing heavily academic. I have lectured at academic venues like the Association for the Sociology of Religion. I've lectured at their annual conferences twice, you know, with panels of sociologists about this cult thing. And so I've been in the academic mix, but I'm not an academic. I mean, my only training, my degree is in fine arts, and that's it. You know, I work as a mental health professional, but I got that training on the job. So I've worked in a psychiatric hospital now for the last 20 years as a crisis caseworker. But yeah, my primary identity is artist.
And that's really kind of what led you out to Santa Fe. Would you agree with that? Can you talk about how you?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I had a degree from the University of Dayton, where I was switched from an engineering major to fine arts, and I got a bachelor's in arts and sciences, and I took some art courses to get started in fine arts. I went to the Pennsylvania Academy after that and got a certificate of accomplishment in painting there in 1975, and I moved to Santa Fe right after that, because Santa Fe at the time was the second or third largest art market in the United States. As a small city, about 50,000 at the time, it had maybe 200 art galleries. It had an international presence in terms of people that came there to buy art. About half the art that was sold there was Western or Native American type of art, but there were continental galleries, meaning they sold modern art and all that sort of thing. So yeah, it was a vibrant town, a lot of art, and that's what attracted me to it.
And you were kind of there before New Mexico became as fashionable. Is that true?
Yeah. When I got there, there was something called the Santa Fe style emerging. And by the late 70s, it became a thing. And there were books written about it in the 80s. There were people decorating their suites in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago Santa Fe style. You know, turquoise jewelry was a thing. Buying these coyotes howling, you know, carved by folk artists was a thing. So yeah, Santa Fe became favorite, you know, among tourists. You know, the tourists I talked to that came there said that Santa Fe was their second favorite place to visit in the United States. You know, New York might be the first, or San Francisco might be the first, or New Orleans might be the first, but Santa Fe was their second.
And I think you say in your book, interestingly, that you're really the trajectory of your life changed the first day you arrived in Santa Fe, correct? Is that right?
Yeah, looking back, it was, you know, if you believe in fate, you know, I could put the pieces together and said there was a hand of something in my life. You know, I drove into town. I took a runaway 16-year-old from Dayton, Ohio, back home to Espanola, which is north of there. Her mother asked me to drive her home, and I did. And I camped out. And the first day I spent in Santa Fe, I mean, I almost had a major wreck coming into town down the ski basin. My U-joint in the car spun out, severed the brake line, and I had no way of stopping. The gears didn't work, the brake didn't work, the emergency wasn't attached very well, and I was careening down a mountain road, and somehow I brought the truck to a stop. Anyway, I got it fixed, and I got into town the next day, and I met this guy, Bill Tate, who's on the cover of this book that I published. And that is the only picture I have of myself with Bill. He became a very good friend of mine over 12 years. But I met him the first day in town. While I was in his gallery, I noticed there was a book, Manly P. Hall's The Secret Teachings of All Ages, that he had, that he hadn't read for years. And there was a magazine. On the cover was this feature article on Nicholas Roerich. He was an artist, a Russian artist, died in 1947, who with his wife began the Agni Yoga Society, which was a major theosophical movement from the 20s. And I read that article, and that, along with Manly P. Hall's book, which I borrowed from Bill that first day, got me thinking about theosophy and the artists that were involved in it, because I had heard about this studying modern art. Kandinsky was somewhat involved with theosophy. Mondrian was, Franz Kupka, William Butler Yeats. I mean, the list is long of modern artists that were influenced by this esoteric approach to spirituality. And Eastern religion was involved in it. Transcendentalism and all of that kind of thing. The early Rosicrucian movement was involved in it. So that got me going. And also the first day in town, after I left Tate's Gallery, I went to this bar, and this fellow introduced me to his uncle as a resource, and because I was going to do construction work, and that uncle owned the old I Am Center. And I eventually worked for that uncle and got to know the I Am cult through the working in their old center there, and I studied their teachings. The I Am was a spin-off of Theosophy. It was also a proto-fascist organization. It was a spin-off of partly of New Thought religion, Theosophy, and something called the Silver Shirts. And if you look at William Pelley's Silver Shirts, they were American fascists that modeled themselves very much on the brown shirts that were emerging in Germany at the time, in the 20s, in the 30s. So I got curious about that religion. I met some other people at a small mall there who were part of this Church Universal and Triumphant. And it was years later that they invited me to come to meetings and all of that. And this Church Universal and Triumphant became the cult that most damaged me, so to speak, or got me involved in what I would call a self-sealing social system for a period of about a year and a half. It was that experience from late 78 until the middle of 1980 that taught me what it means to be, quote, brainwashed, unquote, and to be under the spell or the control of a kind of a transcendental belief system that's deceptive and quite manipulative. So, it was from that experience that I began to study what cults were about in the early 80s and trying to sort it out. The Church Universal and Triumphant used Buddhism, used Hinduism, used fundamentalist Christianity. It used theosophy. It used New Thought. It used chanting. I mean, it combined a bunch of stuff. It claimed to represent the perennial religion. The leader channeled beings in the ascended world from all the religions. It was a crazy mix, and deconstructing that brought me into a wide array of resources to look at what world religions were about and also what new religions were about. So anyway, to get back to your question, all of that was triggered by the first day that I was in Santa Fe.
Right,
had I picked a different day and met a different gallery, my life would have probably been not the same.
Much different. And I mean, the I Am Cult, I think it was it Elizabeth Clare Prophet? Was she the head at the time in 78 to 80? I don't know.
No.
Okay.
But she was the head of a spin-off of the I Am called Church Universal and Triumphant.
Okay.
And it's also called Summit Lighthouse. So she was the leader of that after her husband died from 1973 until she died, I guess within the last decade or so. Actually, she was the head of it till she developed Alzheimer's and couldn't function. Into the 90s, she was the leader. So the I Am cult that I'm talking about was founded in the early 1930s by Edna and Guy Ballard. And so that's a different group. There was a lot of tension between the I Am and the Church Universal and Triumphant, but the I Am claimed that they were the last group in that line, that no more ascended master groups were going to appear after them because they were the true and only one. So that the dozens of ascended master groups that spun off of that are considered fake by the I Am movement, including this Church Universal. So I hope that helps explain it. It's a little complicated.
I did. When I looked at the Ballards and I saw them, they were in the white kind of suits. They kind of looked like Christian evangelists of that time in a way, but they definitely had some. He thought he was the reincarnation of George Washington, right? Wasn't that? And that seemed to be a theme within your book, is all these different types of cult environments. These guys all think their past lives, they were super famous people or whatever. But his wife, Edna Ballard, claimed to be the reincarnation of Benjamin Franklin. Right, that's right. And
so you could switch. In other words, you could switch genders in reincarnation. Yeah. And
even Roerich himself was an artist as well. And I think
he was actually Roerich was quite good. He sold a lot of work to wealthy people. He wasn't considered a great artist by the critics or by his Russian peers, but a lot of Russians loved his work, and so did New Yorkers. So he was a competent illustrator. I mean, his work is good.
I mean, wasn't he the one who inspired the tracing board on the back of the dollar bill? I thought that he got Wallace to put that on the dollar bill. I thought there was some story about that.
Yeah, the story goes that he convinced Henry Wallace, who was Secretary of Agriculture under Roosevelt at the time in the 30s, that all-seeing eye on top of the pyramid needed to be put on there. It was part of the esoteric Egyptian Eye of Horus or whatever, and it was part of the occult background of the real meaning of the United States, that it was overseen by God and by God's emissaries. In other words, his angels, his masters, and all of that are guiding the United States in some way, and that all-seeing eye is there watching us. Little spooky, but it became part of our dollar bill. So that's the story behind it. Yeah.
And I think didn't he influence Roosevelt's wife too? She said it was Besant. She made some kind of, was she a channeler? I don't remember.
Eleanor Roosevelt?
Yeah.
Yeah, Eleanor was a progressive person, and interested somewhat in theosophy. She read the Alice A. Bailey books, which
Bailey,
was
that's right.
Alice Bailey lived from the late 1800s until about 1949. I think she passed away, but she channeled a series of about 20 books from an ascended master called Jwa Kul that she called the Tibetan. And the Tibetan, did these abstruse kind of channelings, like externalization of the hierarchy, for instance. And Bailey was known for her quasi-anti-Semitic stance. And what that means is that she said that the time of devotion, which is the Jewish way of life, is disappearing, that way is gone, and a new way of love wisdom is coming in, like a new age. So she was a herald of something called the New Age. And that old devotional system is gone. So that kind of put her in the anti-Semitic framework. And I mean, she wasn't as fervently anti-Semitic, let's say, as Hitler became. That's not what she was about. But she was displacing the time of the Jews, with the way she taught. And so her work was taken up by a lot of New Age progressive people in the United States. And Eleanor Roosevelt would have meetings in the White House, and they would have people like this. A lot of wealthy and high-level politicians are into this esoteric stuff. They've been initiated into like skulls and bones and crap like that, or I shouldn't say crap, but clubs like that. That other people might find silly if you aren't part of it and you understand what all of it's about. But it's all kind of based on Freemasonry and its secret teachings and levels of awareness and all of that kind of culture. So she took Alice Bailey's Great Invocation, which is the central prayer of something called the New Group of World Servers, which functions under Alice Bailey's teachings, and has been a presence of New Group of World Servers in the United Nations. Now, that doesn't mean that the United Nations represents them in any way. It just means that the United Nations houses a lot of different kinds of clubs and esoteric stuff, because it's, there's different places where you can go meditate there. Right. You can do all kinds of stuff.
There's a meditation room there, right? With the
and it was, for instance, it was set up by Sri Chinmoy. The meditation room was one of them. And Chinmoy claimed to be the United Nations guru at one time, which the United Nations came out and told him to cease and desist, claiming he's the United Nations guru, because he wasn't. Wow. They don't have any such thing. So there's a lot of mixed messages going on about conspiracies about the United Nations, but you have to be really careful about this kind of thing, because the conspiracies are fed by both sides of this debate, because it makes them feel more powerful to know this stuff. Right. And you have to be very careful about how that parses out. It's not as simple, or as systematic as you might think it is.
So your thing was really the Guy Ballard, but also Roerich. So you were always in, or when you were involved, it was the Agni Yoga tradition, correct?
Yeah, that was a lot of what I focused on. I read all those books. I had about 20 or more of them. I had, copies of Roerich's paintings, 8x10s framed around my, room. I emulated his style of painting for about a year, but I kind of gave that up. So he was an inspiration, you might say, to me until the early 80s. A book came out in 1980 that a photographer in New York turned me on to, called Russian Art and American Money. And by that time I was soured on theosophy somewhat anyway, and got out of the Church Universal cult, and I started looking deeper into it. And when I read Russian Art and American Money, it is a big chapter on Roerich and exposing his relationship with wealthy Americans, and why he was banned by the U.S. government from returning to this country. And I looked into the background of that. He apparently didn't pay his taxes on all the paintings he sold, for one. And the other one, the U.S. government hired him to help lead an expedition in 1936 to the Far East in Mongolia to look for plants and seeds that could be useful in the American Dust Bowl in the Southwest, to regenerate the vegetation there, because we had this huge drought back then. The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck was a story about what happened to people during that period. Roerich, on his trip over there, was complained about by the other scientists because all he was interested in was spiritual sites and stuff, and he didn't seem to know a damn thing about seeds and dry things. And the only reason he was there because Henry Wallace, who was a devotee of Roerich, Secretary of Agriculture under Roosevelt, convinced Roosevelt to send him. Right. So they spent all this money on Roerich, and so the government soured on Roerich. Henry Wallace got tremendously embarrassed by his relationship with Roerich because the Washington press got a hold of something called the Guru Papers, his letters back and forth to Roerich, which are very strange and almost QAnon sounding in a way, the way he was writing, and it embarrassed him, and it hurt his campaign to run for president under the Progressive Party.
Oh, interesting.
And then Roerich set up a center in northern India, in Kashmir area, and later, and never came back to the United States. He was lauded in Russia, however. Yeah.
Right. No, you said that there. You showed the picture of him and his wife in their Agni Institute or whatever. But he was also influential. Yeah, he was influential in the States. There was the Roerich Institute in New York. You said you visited that. And I thought it was interesting that he focused on Kanchenjunga, which when you did your world tour, you saw that. But that was also what Aleister Crowley tried to ascend. That was one of his things. So it was.
I noticed your background on Crowley. I've read quite a bit about Crowley, but we can talk about that later. I have had done interventions with Crowley-centered cults.
Really? Interesting.
I didn't
know that. Well,
there's many of them around, huh?
We're getting to that after you kind of came out of your, would you call it maybe a New Age phase or a Theosophy phase? I mean, but you were doing I think that the I Am movement, didn't they do the decreeing where they really chant very fast and are supposed to make changes in the world through this kind of esoteric chanting?
Yeah. Let me explain that. They called it decreeing. And the idea comes both from the Christian Bible and from Eastern teachings about mantras. Okay, so if you combine those two, in Isaiah 45:11, for instance, it says, "Command ye me according to the works of my hands," and so it's a mistranslation because later translations corrected that. That's only in the Old King James, and the idea that was interpreted by the New Thought religions that came out in the 19th century and by I-Amers is that meant that God was giving us a signal that we could command God's energy, and if we did that in full faith, God would have to fulfill his promise. That's the idea from the Christian slant. So the Christian prosperity gospel is based a lot on that, on those kinds of passages in the Bible. Right. And you still see that going on today. That's a very popular American type of spin on Christianity, the prosperity gospel. Right. The other source is in the mantras. And now mantra in its raw translation means to cast a spell. But mantra in its real effect means that you set up a system of words which are very rigorously put together in Sanskrit, and that's linked up to some god. Now there's about 33,000 gods in India or whatever, so you can pick all kinds of things. But that energy to link it up to a god and saying the mantra will bring about an effect, whether it's healing, prosperity, retribution on your enemies. I mean, prayer can cut both ways. You can pray for the downfall of your enemy, and you can pray for the uplifting of your soul. You can do all kinds of things with prayer, mantras, decreeing, or whatever. So the decreeing thing comes out of the affirmations, mainly that were developed during the New Thought era of religions from the late 19th century. Affirmations became a thing, especially when this Frenchman, Coué, who was a New Thought guy in the early 20th century, came up with a French thing that in English is translated in every day and in every way, I am getting better, better, and better. Now, millions of Europeans and Americans in the early 20th century were chanting this thing, whether they believed in New Thought or not. It was just a thing, you know. So what the I Amers did was take these formulas and expand them. Some of them were very long, some were very short, and they began to speak them out loud because they said that, you know, if you speak them out loud, it sets up a physical vibration that would affect reality in a certain way, you know. And so that's called sympathetic magic. In other words, if I slam my hand down here and you hear this noise, and if I think that's going to scare my neighbor across the street, it will, you know. That's the magical idea behind the vibration thing. So and these things were color coded in the I Am religion. For instance, they had blue decrees and pink decrees and gold decrees and white decrees, and each one of the colors had a specific energy associated with it. Blue was power, pink was love, yellow was wisdom, white was spirituality, you know, that kind of thing. Green was healing, and green was prosperity. So if you did a green decree, you would do a healing decree, or you would do a prosperity decree. Now, the more you repeated it and the more will you put behind it, the more power it would have, you know. So more is more. Right. So let me give you an example. One of the violet decrees that I learned initially when I got into this system, it goes, I am a being of violet fire. I am the purity God desires. Okay, so it's kind of like rapping. They rhyme a lot. However, when you actually say it in with other people, it sounds like this. I am being violet fire. I am the purity God desires. I am being violet fire. I am purity God desires. I am being violet fire. I am purity God desires. I am being violet fire. I am purity God desires. So it sounds like rapid auctioneering is what the decreeing sounds like. And you can imagine a room of 3,000 or 4,000 people doing this, what that feels like. It's like a buzzing sound. And if you do it for about a half hour, you get a buzzing feeling in your head. And that feeling is interpreted as spirituality, as a spiritual infusion within the person. And it gives you the sense that there's something working going on there. So that's basically the power prayer of the I Am movement and the Church Universal and Triumphant, and dozens of other similar groups that use decreeing and mantra yoga. It's called mantra yoga as a core of their practice. So I hope that helps.
No, it does, because I've heard it online. You can actually, some of the, either I think it's the Church Universal Triumphant has some of the decreeing happening. It sounds, it sounds like a chant, but also, it's just like you said, it's very unusual. But the people in that group really think that it can create change kind of in the world. It's kind of like a magical chant in some ways. So you kind of became disillusioned, really, you're fortunate in many ways, because you weren't in there for very long. After a couple of years, can you explain how that kind of disenthrallment took place and led to becoming a cult interventionist?
Sure. Most people in these high demand groups are somewhat ambivalent about being in them, because they know that the people on the outside see them as cults, you know, for the most part. Often there's tension with family members once a person gets in, because, you know, obviously any mother, father, brother, sister that isn't a believer is going to think you're going over the edge here, right? So it gets difficult to communicate with family, so that can cause some ambivalence. And so you tend to keep this stuff to yourself when you're in a group like that. And you know, part of the wisdom behind occultism says that if you get into this world of theosophy and Gnosticism and all of that kind of thing, that you should practice something. It's a kind of a mantra that you say to yourself: to know, to dare, to do, and to be silent. You know, so there's this
that goes back to Eliphas. That goes back to Eliphas Levi. That's the
it goes way back there. And, you know, and it comes. Blavatsky studied Eliphas Levi's stuff, you know, but it even goes back to the Freemasons, because you take a vow of silence under the penalty of death, that you don't reveal what goes on in the Brotherhood. And that goes back to the Rosicrucians. It goes back to the ancient Egyptian mysteries. I mean, this is nothing new, that you keep your club secrets secret. You know, that's common. The CIA does it. The FBI does it. The Freemasons do it, and a lot of modern cults do it. You maintain silence about this high wisdom. And the other thing comes from the Christian religion. You do not cast your pearls before swine. That's another thing. That's very much the same thing.
Right. So you had this kind of, you called it a culture in the book, but what was it like trying to come out of that? I mean, it was kind of a difficult, I'm sure it's a difficult process for anybody. I've talked to a bunch of Jehovah's Witnesses, Scientologists, and how it changed really their way of looking at the world and themselves.
Yeah, it does. The one word I can tell you, it's painful. And when you look at the theories behind mind changing, when somebody's strong belief system gets disconfirmed, and they see it, they see evidence for disconfirmation, they go into cognitive dissonance. In general, when people suffer cognitive dissonance, meaning they get confused at what's real, what's not, they tend to retreat back to the belief system, begin to rationalize it. You can see this happening with this assault on Congress with a lot of the people now. Rather than saying they made a mistake, what do? They double down and reinforce what they did as if it was the right thing to do. So this is normal human behavior, to reinforce your own beliefs when there's disconfirming evidence for it. But some people begin to see that, like I did, that the world I'm in, there's something is wrong within this, because I saw conflicts within the movements. Agni Yoga did not agree with the I Am movement. The I Am movement did not agree with Church Universal and Triumphant. The Alice Bailey movement had a lot of things that were very different about it, and yet they were all supposedly channeling the same ascended masters. You see my point. They were supposed to be unified. They were supposed to represent the perennial wisdom, which was, released to mankind in ancient times, 60,000 years ago or something, which is another bogus idea. But however, that was the concept, that there was a brotherhood of all religions, right? In Theosophy. Yet all I saw was fractured groups that were getting more and more fractured. Almost like in Christianity, you see, 1,600 denominations today. What I mean? So the idea of one gospel is kind of a myth, but people want to hold on to that, and so I began to fall apart within about this whole thing. My first wife divorced me because I was involved in this, because she said, you're not the man I married. You're different. I was different. I was 24/7 involved in this crazy stuff that I see as crazy now. So I was having panic attacks at night. I was getting up like 4 a.m. with stomach cramps. When I started thinking about leaving this, it was a confusing time to me, because I didn't know if I could trust myself in even doing research. What was fake news? What wasn't fake news? What was real scholarship? What was not? And I had to slow myself down somehow, and I didn't have anyone to turn to at the time. I think the reason I became, a researcher in this area is I wanted to become the person that I wish I could have met then, to talk to.
Interesting, right? Right.
And so, I did what a lot of people do. You turn to what's familiar to get some help. I write about this in the book. I grew up in the Catholic tradition, so I'm very familiar with it. I was an altar boy. I could recite the Mass in Latin, back in the day, and all of that sort of thing. And I was familiar with that culture. There was a nunnery near St. John's College in Santa Fe that was Carmelite nuns, which you don't see because they're behind closed doors. They're hidden. But there was one nun who was there in the main office that would talk to the public that would come in to give gifts or to give messages to the nuns that are in the cloistered area. And this lady's name was Sister Teresa. When I knew her, she was 64 years old, or 65. She was about 4'10". She became a nun when she was around 60. After she had raised 4 sons, and her husband had passed away. Her family was doing very well. She decided to dedicate her life to God this way, So it was almost a Hindu tradition, because in Hinduism you become a householder and then you go on a spiritual journey. after you fulfilled all your dharma. And so she was almost following a Hindu pattern in a way. But she was a sweet woman, and I would just stop and talk to her now and then. I even gave her a gift of one of my paintings. And so while I was hiking up on the mountain up there, Sun Mountain, I decided to stop in and talk to her and just unload about this conflict I was going on, you know, the spiritual conflict. She had no idea what I was talking about, theosophy, Rosicrucians, you know, and all this stuff. I was babbling for about 15 minutes. And she just slowed me down and she said, Joseph, can I pray with you? And so she did. She just started a normal Christian type prayer, invoking God and the saints as Catholics do, and asked, you know, for help and all of this. And for some reason, I just started crying like hell, you know, when I was there. It just sort of emptied out. And when I left there, you know, I thanked her. And that day, I don't know how to explain this other than it's a psychosomatic reaction. That kindness she showed, I think, just helped me relax inside. And I felt what Mormons might call a burning in the bosom, which I was on fire. My whole body felt heated up. And it lasted hours, you know. And I even took a cold shower for about 45 minutes, just standing there in this cold shower, just trying to chill out. And I felt different. The next day, everything settled down. You know, I didn't feel like suddenly joining the Catholic Church again or anything. That wasn't what this was about. It wasn't about Catholicism. It was about some kind of human connection that helped me release this. I needed a relationship, you know, and so I think that's where love is. It doesn't exist as an abstraction. It's always in a relationship. It's in the real time and real world. It's not something you send with cards and stuff, you know. So, but
you wrote in the book, that was, I think you use this term often, quoting Wittgenstein, which is the fly figures its way out of the fly bottle.
Yeah, she helped me to somehow begin to get out of the fly bottle. In other words, out of that closed system in my head. And after that point, I began to look back at the critical books on theosophy that I had already looked at, you know, but felt different about them. And when I read them and read about a critical book about the I Am movement and others, I was seeing it with fresh eyes, you know, and I was able to absorb and extend the information without feeling guilty or impeded in any kind of a psychological way. You know, in other words, I could entertain doubts now, healthy doubts, and that's what it was. It was a matter of being freed up to do real academic research and sorting this stuff out, which took me years, because I read a lot of books that were useless to me after I read them, and it took me a while to compile really useful information, or what I call pragmatic information, that I could build on. And you know, one thing led to another. I began to write a little bit about my experience. I got to know some ex-members of Church Universal. They introduced me to some parents that were concerned, that wanted to talk to me about my research. My name got around, cult awareness networks that were around, and I suddenly got swept up in that world as a resource person. And then deprogrammers and exit counselors called me to come help on cases. And I thought I would try it out because it sounded interesting. Before I knew it, I was getting one call after another, and it turned into a living for 12 years. I actually did nothing else to make a living except some artwork, traveling around doing that kind of work. It was, that's why I wrote the memoir. I wanted to kind of capture a little bit about that period.
Right. And I mean, you include so many references to the books you found helpful in your book. And I think that's also a great reference. Like, there's a lot of I would say this book is chock full of wisdom from what you've learned. So I highly recommend people. This book may be the personage that you should read before you get into a cult. So I would suggest people read this. But can you talk? You talk about some of the case studies. You were actually arrested and tried up in Idaho. Can you talk about some of the cult mechanics of, well, you call it exiting, or there's different terms, deprogramming?
Right. Well, basically, an intervention is just getting an opportunity to educate someone. That's all it is. because what you're talking about, some journalists call this information disease. When somebody is living under, seeing patterns where there aren't any, that's called apophenia. That's a kind of a mental disease. You see a face of somebody in a cloud where there isn't really a face up there, but they think that it has something to do with the face. People see constellations in the sky and develop mythologies about them. I mean, we do this all the time. Human beings are pattern-making creatures. We do it to make sense of the world, and sometimes make good sense, and sometimes it's just BS, but we do it all the time. We always look for these patterns. We need to do it in science. We have to look for patterns and see if they match up with reality. Yeah, where was that question going?
Well, I was just like your approach to interventions. I mean, there was differing approaches. You had talked about this guy who would literally kidnap people and kind of hold them.
Was Ted Patrick and a number of others. And I got caught up in that world a little bit. It was part of my career for about 6 years. I would help on cases where someone had been held against their will. My goal when coming in after that was done was to try to convince the person to talk freely and get rid of the security, which happened most of the time, but it didn't always happen. And so you could get into legal trouble. But for the most part, the interventions were, they might start by surprise, but the cult member, so to speak, had control. If they wanted me to leave, if they didn't want to talk, then it was over. So the skill was to gain rapport and get them interested in information quick enough that the cult member would say, okay, I want to hear what you have to say, but I'm going to give you 2 hours, or I'm going to give you 5 minutes, or, because my parents want me to talk to you, or my wife wants me to talk to you, I'll talk to you for today, and that's it, But then the job of the interventionist was to keep it going, because it usually took several days at least to get enough valuable information out there to reflect on for this brain to begin to shift the neural nets around and see things in a different way. It doesn't happen easily, and it doesn't happen quickly. There's no snapping people out, Now, at some point in 10, 20, 30 hours of discussion, sometimes people will suddenly come to an awareness and they begin talking about the group in the past tense. And once I start hearing that, I realize, well, we've turned a corner here. They're not in the group psychologically anymore. They might have emotional ties to it. They might need to clean up a lot, which could take some work. But I've gotten their point of view expanded enough where they no longer fit into a constricted mentality. And that's the goal, is to expand a person's point of view during intervention. Because most cults are very constricted when it comes to information and what you believe and who you believe.
Right. And I mean, you covered so many different groups in this. I mean, you talk about Scientology, Unification Church, and so you're kind of on their list as what they would call a deprogrammer, and try to harass you or whatever. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've gone through a lot of harassment in different ways. I mean, the group I was in, the I Am and Church Universal, I found later on from ex-members that were deep into the group that I was on the chanting list, where they would decree, for my karma to descend on me and blah, 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 and all of that, and so there's that metaphysical attack, which I didn't feel, but they was there. I would get phone calls sometimes from groups that, a member that would scream at me or threaten me or whatever. And I usually handled those pretty well, and they would never call me back again. I'm not easy to rattle. Maybe that's why I work in a psych emergency department. I stay pretty calm around pretty active patients that are difficult. And I'm not saying that that's anything special, but it's just the way I'm made up.
Well, I thought that was interesting in some of your interventions, that sometimes these people weren't in the grips of a cult or a coercive environment, but were not mentally well off too. So that was kind of like your... That's
true. There are people now people that are really unstable tend to get kicked out of these groups. I mean, the one thing about cults is they want to be efficient and they want deployable agents. They don't want people that are a load, that are a problem. So crazy people get kicked out of cults. It's a misnomer to think that just because the teachings are a little crazy to you and their behavior is odd, doesn't mean that the people are crazy. They tend to be like you and I, or the average person on the street in general. They can function very well. When they present at grocery stores or have to lecture about their group, they can be very convincing and very nice and charming and whatever. They're not dysfunctional, which is what crazy means. So people in these groups tend to be highly motivated. It depends on the nature of the group, whether it's very intellectual or not, whether it demands a high IQ or not. There's 1,000 different kinds of versions of this out there that can attract thousands of different kinds of people. So there's something out there tailor-made just about for anybody. I'll give you an example. I did an intervention with a young medical student who was in graduate medical school. He was in a group in Louisiana associated with a professor that he had, and the name of the group escapes me now, but the professor had about 30 students in these kind of meetings, like a club, that would come to hear him talk. And he was having extraordinary control over them. His main focus or teaching, like there's Aleister Crowley, but this was George Gurdjieff. You've heard about Gurdjieff.
Gurdjieff, yeah. Gurdjieff.
Yeah, he lived from the late 19th century and died like in 1949, I believe. But he was an infamous spiritual teacher, guru, cult leader. During the 20s especially and the 30s, he was well known. The great architect, oh God, I can't remember now. But anyway, he had a lot of high-level people involved in Gurdjieff teachings. They were called the Fourth Way teachings. So this professor, medical professor, was using Gurdjieff teachings and had these people under his thrall, these students, and their sacrament, their ritual that they would do at the end of each session was to drink a shot of Jack Daniels, whiskey. So I did an intervention, and this guy was very arrogant, the young man. He didn't think I could teach him anything. When I first met him, he was just standing there. He wouldn't even sit down. His family introduced me to him, and there was a female interventionist there that brought me in. He wasn't held against his will, but he knew that if he didn't talk to me, his parents weren't going to support him in medical school anymore because he was wasting his time going to this thing, this cult thing all the time. So it took about 2 hours for me to gain rapport with him, and then he finally relaxed because he knew I knew a lot about Gurdjieff. I had read Meetings with Remarkable Men. I'd read a lot of the Gurdjieff work. I had already done interventions with other Gurdjieff groups. And so, and I knew that the so-called Sarmun Brotherhood that Gurdjieff claimed to get his teachings from didn't exist. It was like Madame Blavatsky's Ascended Masters or something. It was some bogus Sufi group that Gurdjieff talked about. So, once I began to deconstruct some of that, he got very interested and relaxed. And within about 2 days, he decided that's it. He's not going back to this thing at the school anymore. And I don't know if that group broke up right after that because the word got out that there was this exposure of what this guy was doing. But it didn't last very long. I think it broke apart in the next 5 years or so.
And you have a lot of information about a lot of these people that still some have some credibility. Like there's Jay-Z Knight is around. You exposed Blavatsky as a clever plagiarist. Gurdjieff is a clever liar. I mean, you've covered Sai Baba. Like I grew up in Northern California where it was just a hodgepodge of different religions. And I knew people who were followers of all kinds of Indian gurus of all different tribes. Guru Ma, I think, was the woman's name. And it was just everywhere. Benjamin Krem is one that was interesting. That
I met him twice. I met Krem twice. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about him, please?
Benjamin Krem. He died not long ago. He was an artist in England, Scottish English, and I think he was in London at the time. He was a disciple or a student of the Alice Bailey teachings that we mentioned, which was a form of theosophy. Sometime in the 70s, I believe, he began to get inspired by the being called Maitreya, and he began to channel Maitreya. And Maitreya is the Buddhist tradition, is the coming Buddha, which is supposed to be like tens of thousands of years in the future. But a lot of cult people claim Maitreya is here now, for whatever reason. And Krem was the main one. So Krem taught that Maitreya was the Christ, the avatar of the age that was going to herald the new age coming in. So in 1982, I believe it was, him and his organization took out full-page ads in 4 major newspapers around the world: the New York Times, the LA Times, the London Times, and I think Japan, the Tokyo, I'm not sure. But this was expensive, full-page ads. The Christ is now here.
Right, I remember this. I remember.
A lot of copy about how he was going to appear, and Benjamin Krem is kind of like as John the Baptist is going to announce him. And he would appear through the clouds, meaning he would come in an airplane, and he would land somewhere and announce himself, but he would have to be accepted by mankind first. And so Krem's job was to convince enough people to accept him so that he could appear, right? And so he went on a lecture tour, and he came to Santa Fe. He lectured at the Sheraton there, and I went to the first lecture he gave in 1982 there. And I remember Krem, he's a white-haired little guy, and he was kind of soft-spoken and, charming in some way. And he talked about all this theosophy stuff and, the coming Maitreya. And, there were about maybe 100 some people in the audience. Halfway through, there were maybe 50 people left. And toward the last quarter of the talk, there were maybe about 30 people left there because they just started leaving because he sounded kind of nutty. But there were some people there that were totally into him and just eyes wide open and glowing and listening. And then what he did was he said he would have Maitreya, the Christ, overshadow him. He would sit there and he would stare into your eyes and allow the light of the Maitreya to come into you. So people were having all kinds of reactions, when he stared at them, and this comes from autosuggestion and suggestion. It's a real common theme in hypnotic relationships, that's been studied before. So he was taking advantage of that, but the people there thought it was a real spiritual thing. Now, I didn't know what it was at the time because I was early in my research in 1982 about all this. And so I sat there and he went right by me. He didn't look into my eyes, I was right there toward the front row. So I thought, what the hell? He's moving this way toward the left of the room. So I got up and I moved all the way to the left of the room because I wanted to see what this was. And so he finally looked at me. I was the last person he looked at. And when I looked at him, I had a hard time keeping my eyes open. I had a psychological reaction is what happened.
Interesting.
I was spiritualizing at the time, thought I was in a spiritual battle. Like dark and light or whatever. That was what I was thinking at the time. But really, it was just a psychological reaction as I look back on it. So
I've heard that he had control over some of his audiences. I've seen weird videos online.
Oh, they saw all kinds of things. But yeah. In my studies of gurus, people see all kinds of things that they project or transference, it's called, onto the guru. They will see golden light. They will see the guru levitate. They will see the guru change in form and from a person to a blue god. I mean,
their astral body or something. Yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah.
People report all kinds of things when this charismatic relationship is set up. Yeah. So with Krem anyway, Krem stopped gazing at me. He threw his hands in the air. He said, "That's it. That's enough." And he got up and he walked off stage. So I said, "Well, what the hell was that all about?" No, I saw him again a year later, and I went through that gazing thing again with him, and I felt nothing. And he had a big crowd.
Within the Christian community, people were interested in Krem as the Maitreya being kind of the representation of the Antichrist.
Yes, so I knew that. The fundamentalist Christian community was very much into like Tex Mars and
yes. Yeah.
I knew
some other commentators.
The lady that wrote the The Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow, Constance Coleman.
Combi,
She was
yes.
a real
yeah.
critic of the New Age, and I got to know her a little bit. She was a true believer in occult powers. She believed they were evil. I kind of emerged from that in the early 80s. I saw that this is a construct of the human mind. If you want to believe in it, it's going to affect you. Right. And so I don't put any energy into it. And when I stopped doing that, I mean, I have no effect from all of this energy being thrown at me by cult leaders. I've always slept well. I'm very healthy. I'm 73. I don't take any medication.
Oh, good.
I rarely call out sick. So I don't know where the hell this occult power is. And I've been a critic of this stuff for 40 years, So if it's there, I don't know what's protecting me, but I don't get it.
Well, one of the sentences from your book that I left in my notes was, "We are easily fooled by experiential and somatic signs, as I would soon begin to learn, as many former Mormons know." So, like, even these so-called changes are driven by belief, I would say, physical, psychosomatic changes. Would you agree with that?
I agree. Now, don't get me wrong. Human beings function on trust. They function on belief because there's a lot of mysterious things here in relationships and in the world, the science, nature world, and in the social world. And we have to do something that sociologists call plausibility structures in order to just reduce anxiety. So we come up with stuff that might not be right, but we have to hold on to it to just get by day to day. I mean, just simply put, we put up a plausibility construct that supermarkets have safe food to eat, right? And now we can't prove that every day when we go in there, or else we go nuts trying to prove it. But we have a trust system built on that. And sometimes the trust system's wrong because the supermarket has to pull stuff that is toxic, because the FDA discovered that this is not good and they have to get it out of there, and people sue the company, and all that stuff happens. But we need to have belief systems. Plato called them, and I've mentioned this in my book, pious frauds, or noble lies. They are almost necessary. They're not intentional frauds. They're not harmful even. And they might be useful. So I might be getting into odd territory here, but there are people out there that are cynical about this and believe that it's good to have people believe in a particular lockdown version of Islam or Christianity or Judaism or whatever, in an orthodox or some kind of fundamentalist bizarre way, in order for society to be controlled, even though it's bogus. We have to hold on to it. We can't change it. And then you have these rigid societies like Saudi Arabia and North Korea, as a result of that. So the pious fraud becomes constricting. It's no longer noble. It's no longer a useful way to run a society. Our founding fathers in the United States knew that the realities had to be constructed. And they were constructing one with the Constitution. They knew it was an experiment. It wasn't dropped down to us by God. This was a human experiment, very much, hopefully, supported by a divine presence, but they knew it was human. And I think the wisdom of the U.S. Constitution is that it's flexible. It changes. It can be amended. There are many things which were flawed in society back when it was founded. Women couldn't vote. Blacks were slaves. I mean, there was all kinds of things like that had to be and continue to have to be amended. We can't stop changing who we are. It has to remain pragmatic, in other words. And I think that's the lesson I learned through all this, is that for human beings to be healthy, they have to be pragmatic to some extent. They can't become fundamentalists. They can't lock into a constricted, pious fraud or a worldview. It's just not going to work in the long run. It's going to break apart because human beings don't function well under that. I mean, you can see Saudi Arabia busting at the seams over there. Women want to drive cars. Women want freedom of expression over there. And eventually it's going to break out. It's going to happen over there.
It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. I mean, and you talk kind of about the four things about a cult, like transcendent attraction, exclusive authority, circular tension, exit perils, and dread to defect. So these are like those kind of I would say, in that kind of totalist environment, is to have those things and maintain it. But we're at an hour, Joe. Do you have anything you'd like to add, or anything I missed, or can you talk about your social media contacts if people want to reach out to you?
Yeah, I started a YouTube channel. I don't know where it's going because it's kind of crude. I use my iPhone in my studio. I was encouraged to do it because of this QAnon thing out there, to kind of comment on some of that.
What are your thoughts about QAnon?
It's got a very crazy history. It has some roots in like I mentioned, in the early fascist movements in the United States, which believed in these kind of same conspiracies. The I Am certainly did, and so did the group I was involved in. I mean, I can almost see a version of my group in QAnon part of it. QAnon also has attracted people that what I call wounded narcissists, people who maybe aren't that prone to really study government in its real form, but will want to believe that government is against them and their freedoms, because it takes their money away in taxes. They don't know where the money's going. It looks like a mystery, like a deep state out there. The wounded narcissist is someone that wants to blame other people for their problems, that their lack of accomplishment, their inability to function. And they also believe that their identity is going to be taken away. They're very insecure type people. All narcissists are insecure. So they want to put up walls, and they want to keep the immigrant out, or they want to make it, quote, legal, which means very restricted as to who can come in and out of the United States. They want control of it. They want authoritarian control. That's what a wounded narcissist wants. So I think that if anything, I would encourage people that hear this interview to kind of look into that, see if they have some of that in them, and or other people they might know, because most of these people that are involved in this kind of QAnon or whatever basically want to be good citizens. That's the appealing part. They want a better world. That's the hook, where if I was to do an intervention, that's my highway into their world, where I can begin to explore, okay, you want a better world, how do you see this functioning? And then start helping them through education, deconstruct some of their ideas, and maybe improve on how they interpret the government, or how they interpret some of the stuff that's being fed to them through social media that is, completely not true.
No, it's fascinating that you say that, because it makes me think like that QAnon, there's these missives that come out almost like from a cult leader, and then you have to really try to, look at the tea leaves or the animal guts or whatever to try to ascertain what its meaning is. And it becomes kind of like people are getting these rushes after trying to understand, and then they're on the inside. And then they're always talking about they're going to prosecute and put these people in jail, and there's 65,000 indictments, and nothing ever happened. Nothing really ever happened. So
well, they're creating potential patterns, and people put the patterns together because we are pattern making animals. So they take advantage of that. The people that are into this don't realize they're being taken advantage of. I'll finish off with this. There's a book which I recommend everybody read if they're interested in this, called Brainwashing: The Science of Thought Control by Kathleen Taylor. And it came out within the last decade or so. And there's a section in there called A Traitor in Your Skull, which basically means that our brains can deceive us, because if we don't pay attention through judgment, how we're interpreting reality. And so there's a lot of different ways that our better judgments can be bypassed using these techniques of throwing patterns at you or whatever to influence the way you think. It's fascinating to study it. Information is power. If you get the right information, if you get the wrong information, you're going to get information disease, and you're going to be controlled by the disease.
And there's a lot of information out, so don't get that disease information. What's your work? We contacted through Facebook too, so you're on Facebook in as much. So if people want to reach out to you there, and what's the book you're working on?
Well, I don't really even have a title for it yet. I'm just beginning to construct it, but it might take me years. Who knows? I have a full-time job, and it's hard for me to find time to write like that. But based on all my notes and all this, I probably want to give a better handle on the types of cults that are out there, to kind of break it down a little bit into a systematic way of looking at this sort of thing, and maybe refine what I said in my memoir about the structure, of how these work, and also just warn people there's always surprises. You might educate yourself. There's one book by Pratt Canis and Aronson called the Age of Influence, and I think that's the title. Anyway, they state in there that to be forewarned is not to be forearmed. I mean, you can study about this, but you can get caught off guard by something that doesn't look like what you read about, and before you know it, you're down the rabbit hole.
Right. That's a great point. And you also have a novel as well, Mushroom Satori, right?
Yeah.
And that's also available.
Mm-hmm.
What a great interview. Thanks so much, Joe. Let people go read this book before you join any coercive groups. So this will definitely disenthrall you before you need to be disenthralled. Again, the title of the book is Santa Fe, Bill, Tate and Me, How an Artist Became a Cult Interventionist by Joe Szimhart, spelled Szimhart, published January 20th, 2020. So again, Joe, thank you so much for the interview. Thanks.
Pleasure. Thank you, William, and thanks for asking me.
All right. Take care. Have a great day.